So the first panel discussion for which I think all of you have come here is on the new regulatory architecture envisioned by the NEP. And in this session, what we are going to do, this session will look at what, why, and how of the changes in the regulatory architecture governing school education as recommended by the NEP 2020. And this session will be moderated by Ms. Bhuvna Anand. So first I invite Bhuvna on the dais. Bhuvna is the founder director of Trayash. She has more than 16 years of experience in public policy research and has worked extensively alongside government and civil society partners on creating an enabling environment for enterprises, regulatory simplification, and reforming welfare programs. The next, I would like to invite Mr. Jaiprakash Pandeji, IRPS. Shri Jaiprakash Pandeji is currently serving as Director, Department of School Education and Literacy, Ministry of Education. He is an Indian Railway Personnel Service Officer of the 2003 batch. He is also an author, poet, and columnist. His areas of interest are education, travel, and public policy. His latest books are Pagdandi Mein Pahad and Dur Need Ke Pakshi, and he tweets quite a bit about all his poetry work, so do follow him on Twitter as well. My next speaker for this panel is Mr. Ayush Prasadji, IAS. Shri Ayush Prasadji is an IAS officer. He is currently posted as the Chief Executive Officer of Zilla Parishad Pune. He is also the chairperson of the committee constituted to set up the State School Standard Authority as recommended in NEP in Maharashtra. One of his core areas of interest is the school accreditation framework that lays the path for continuous improvement in the quality of education. And I'm very, very thankful to Ayush ji. He traveled all the way from Pune to be here and be part of this important panel. My next speaker for the panel is Dr. Parth Shah, Founder, Director, Center for Civil Society. Parth, I invite you to the dais. Dr. Parth Shah is the...
only the founder.
Founder president. Okay. So Dr. Parth Shah was founder of Center for Civil Society and now co-founder of Indian School of Public Policy. His research and advocacy work focuses on themes of economic freedom, choice and competition in education, property rights, approach to the environment, and new public management. He has been a member of the Education Task Force for Delhi and Karnataka state governments and also serves on the Senate of Himachal Pradesh and Tamil Nadu Central Universities. Dr. Shah holds a PhD in economics and has taught at the University of Michigan, along with being a visiting faculty at JNU, Delhi University, MS University, Vadodara. He has also written extensively for Indian and international journals and has edited several books. And my next speaker is Professor Geeta Gandhi Kingdon, Geeta ji please, who is the Chair of Education and International Development at University College London. Prior to being there, she worked at the Department of Economics, University of Oxford for 10 years. She has a BSc Honours in Economics from the London School of Economics and MSc and DPhil in Economics from the University of Oxford. Her research on economics of education is based mostly on statistical analysis of education data sets in developing countries. Based on her research, she advises governments and donor agencies on education policy. Now I hand over the critical task to Bhuvna to lead the panel. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Amit, thank you for having all of us convene together to talk about how do we improve learning outcomes for the children of India, right? And as Shavita, you set the tone, it's about all children. Sure. And about how do we all converge on creating a system that works in this direction, right? More than anything else. And I remember, I think 2018, we were in the office. When the Rangan committee report was released, And all of us, I think, sort of had this euphoric moment where we saw chapter 8 of the Kasturi Rangan Committee report, which for the first time acknowledged that there was a problem in the architecture of how education was to be delivered in this country. And we'd been, Parth in particular had led the charge on this idea. And to see it reflected in such strong, unambiguous terms in the report was both euphoric, but also finally sort of a coming home that, look, this is important. We haven't just been imagining the import of this idea. So what is this idea? Uh, Chapter 8 of the new education policy talks about accreditation and standard setting and how the system is to be governed or regulated. And this primarily refers to the private schooling system and how we might create an enabling environment for the private schooling system, but also how we might apply the same standards or the high benchmarks to the public schooling system. And there are some pretty radical recommendations in terms of how do we go about getting this kind of standard setting. So I want to start by talking with Parth a little bit on the idea itself, right? What's the key idea of chapter 8? And what's the, sort of why is it so salient that this be carried forward in its, in the way the report imagines, or the policy imagines?
Thank you, Buna. Okay, I guess it's working. Okay. I think it's great that you reminded of what happened when the Kasturanga report came out. This idea of separation of powers or separation of functions, right? It's a very old idea in a sort of general sense, but somehow we had not applied that idea to the education sector, even though we did apply the idea to many other sectors like telecom, banking and finance, in insurance. We have separate regulators in all of those areas, right? And separate service providers and a separate policymaker. But that hasn't been the case in education. So when we first sort of brought this problem out for discussion, and I remember Buna was also involved, so was Amit Chandra at the time at the Center for Civil Society. And we held some public meetings to discuss the idea. Many people thought that this was just like a think tanker sitting around in their conference rooms and dreaming up problems in the education system where they don't exist, right? And only people who work, obviously, in the field can understand what the challenges are and hopefully provide some solutions. But I think this is a great example of what think tanks can do, right? Being outsider, we have different point of view. Of course, we need both people inside who can also see what the problems are and how to address them. At the same time, obviously, as we know in any organization that we have run, that once you are inside, there are only similar things you will see, some things you would miss. And therefore, you need people from outside to look at those challenges and also point out what kind of reforms are required. I think that's really is the, in my view, a function of a think tank. And I'm very happy and proud that CCS has been able to perform that role in this particular instance. And I can say that loudly because I'm no longer director of CCS. So I can give the credit to Center for Civil Society in this behalf. I think fundamental idea has been very similar, like we have 3 branches of government, right? Why do we have 3 and not the old system of one king or queen running everything that we had for thousands of years, right? So we learned what makes for good governance, right? Is separation of functions, separation of powers. And I think same idea has been applied in telecom, banking, other areas. We're now applying that in education. I think it's a great governance reform that needs to be done. I know the NEP talks about more in terms of conflict of interest as a justification for creating independent regulator. In my view, I think that's a byproduct of what would happen. I think main reason is very simple, that you need to have a division of labor and specialization. Regulation is a very important, very specialized field. And you cannot have one single person, say Secretary of Education, being able to do all of those functions well. I think, so primary reason in my view for the separation of functions is you become specialized, you have a deeper understanding and expertise in what it means to regulate the education system, right? And hopefully that also brings more accountability, as we discussed earlier in the presentations, to the system. I would say one thing, just hearing about the report and all of that, right? I still see, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong in my perception, I still see a defensive tone when we talk about private sector and its role in education, right? You can see that in the presentation that was made earlier, right? Now, I really wonder that unless we are able to acknowledge honestly and fully, right, the role the private sector plays, we are just going to sort of beat around the bush in a sense, even with the independent regulator, same thing are going to continue if the perception and the mindset doesn't really change. And I feel that despite all the work that has been done so far by many organizations in sort of making understanding what private sector does in education in India particularly, you see this defensive tone, right? So you didn't hear, even though the whole report was about non-state actors, you did not hear anything about what challenges are the sector faces, except for general sort of 5 recommendations that came at the end of the report, right? When people who work in the sector know what the challenges are far more deeply. It actually sort of talked about how in India, public spending is lower than other countries without acknowledging the private sector spending that India does undertake, right? So if you add up the public sector spending and the private sector spending is actually quite high. But you can see that defensive tone of not talking about what the parents are spending on education themselves, in addition to what government spends, right? So I feel that that defensiveness still remains in somehow, and unless we are able to address that part of it, my sense is that the architectural reforms in governance may not sort of lead to the outcome that we want to see. Long preamble to the idea.
No, but Parth, I think you touch on something really important. And I want that phrase, right, that acknowledge the role of the private sector. I would say one step further, celebrate the role of the private sector, right? That these are folks who are, there's a combination of the aspiration of everybody coming together with the response to that aspiration. And that's non-trivial. We've got to be able to both celebrate it and, sort of see it as a movement of in the right direction, at least in my view. I want to read from chapter 8, just the first line of it, to be able to, sort of direct the question to Geeta. The goal of the school education regulatory system must be to continually improve educational outcomes. It must not overly restrict schools, prevent innovation, or demoralize teachers, principals, and students. All in all, regulation must aim to empower schools and teachers with trust, enabling them to strive for excellence and to perform their very best. Right? I really like the tone that the start of this chapter presents, Geeta. And I want to learn from you that in education, where have we successfully seen the application of such an architecture? What does the evidence tell us about the relationship between educational attainment for children and experimenting with regulatory reform? I'm curious to hear from your years of sort of studying the sector very carefully.
So you're focusing on the regulation, enabling regulation. So if you look at yeah, so the architecture of regulation in our country is uh, unfortunately a kind of a standoff situation seems to exist, whereby instead of seeing these two tracks, the private and the public, as two alternative forms of provision which can coexist side by side without feeling competitive with each other, but rather more complementary, because it's kind of differentiated demand to some extent. And uh, I feel that the main problem is that if I am allowed to deviate just momentarily from the subject that you raised, but because it's kind of related, that the reason why there is this anti-private feeling is because private sector charges fee, and that excludes a large fraction of the population from access to private schooling. And that is seen as exclusive, making the private sector exclusive and something that is only accessible to those who are able to pay. How have other countries done it? They have chosen, even a very socialist country like Sweden, they have chosen to, if they want to reform education and they feel that they cannot, in a regulatory manner, they cannot improve the regulation to get the public sector schooling system to deliver results, to provide good quality education. They have, chosen to still fund education, but do it through, not insist on also being the provider of it. They are content to be just the funder of it, talking about the architect. And they are content to let the private sector operators provide publicly funded education. So it's separating out the funding function from the operation function. And I think that that's another aspect of this point that Parth raised about, the separation of powers. And, the same thing is large if you look at, for example, in so many countries, the charter schools, the concession schools.
If we change the mic, possibly the sound
Oh, sorry.
is slightly better.
The charter schools, the concession schools in charter schools in the U.S., the concession schools in several South American countries, all based on the same idea that the public sector funds education so that nobody is deprived of the, everybody has an equal chance. And but not insisting on the private sector, not insisting on the public sector also being the operator, because that comes with all the problems that Parth described. The conflict of interest, government is not only the funder, it is also the operator of schools, it is also the assessor of the outcomes of children in the school, it is also the regulator, not only of itself, but of the other providers, which is the private sector. And because there has been a perception that there has been an exodus from the government schooling sector. In the last 1 or 2 years, we're told that there is a bit of a movement back, and that's a very wonderful thing that is the case. If parents have more confidence in the free option, why should they have to bypass the free option and pay separately, as well as being taxpayers through huge indirect taxation, which pays for public, provision of services like education, as well as that, have to then separately also pay a fee for private schooling. So that's a tragedy. So if they are coming back to the public sector, that's a thoroughly fantastic thing that should be celebrated. But I think that what's needed is to separate out these things in terms of the architecture. I think we can have more imaginative ways of running education.
It's very helpful, Geeta. I do want to turn to our colleagues who are, of course, fighting on the front lines to execute this idea, right? Ayush Prasadji, maybe we can start with you. Where are we in the journey of implementing the NEP's Chapter 8 recommendations around setting up of the independent regulator, and then, of course, get the regulator to function in the way that we want?
Thank you for having me here from the front lines to actually go back and actually discuss what is happening on the front. So I just want to tell you, where are we currently? We are very far from actually executing this, because firstly, there is no acceptance of this idea. So when we look at other sectors, primarily when you were talking about in the financial sector, for example, the regulator is different from the one who's implementing. All of those things are at the larger national level. When it comes to education, it's a state subject, and states are generally not good at dividing responsibilities, creating multiple organizations that are fundamentally free from each other. So for example, the current role that I play, or which is played at the state level, we are not only funding operating schools in the primary sector, we are funding education in the secondary sector, and we are also assessing schools for the self-financed ones, and we are also assessing the children who are studying in those schools through various examinations. So we are doing the entire ecosystem of education, splitting them into multiple. So there are organizations which do, but then they keep converging at the state level, they keep converging at the district level, and also they keep converging at semi-state level, which is the commissionerate level of or directorate level of at the education department. So if what I understand from my work leading the school. I was actually appointed the person to plan out the execution of the national education policy, not necessarily the accreditation part. And we started by doing accreditation because when we looked at, if I may just go on a little as just tell a bit of history in this. When we looked at the education system in India, it goes back to 1850s. And that is how it has evolved over the years. This is probably the second oldest system that is existing in India, the primary education, apart from the collectorate system, the district administration collectorate system. Now, from 1850s, it has evolved itself in various phases. And currently, if you look at it, for Maharashtra at least, we are governed by an act of 1965, which is pretty much, and then government orders and government resolutions that have come after that. From 1965 onwards, there are about 913 government resolutions. You can bucket them into 7 categories, which is to do with schools, to teachers, what you're providing to students, etc., etc. If you look at our expenditure, it is roughly around about $10 billion, which is around 70,000 crores, where bulk of it, almost 90% of it, goes for teacher salary. So if you say that our education expenditure is more on, a Gurukul based of system, a teacher teaches a student. That is our primary focus. Now, if you say that let us increase education expenditure, we need to increase education expenditure. We need to also create on absorption capacity. We do not have the ecosystem of suddenly, let's say, we suddenly decide to double out expenditure. Will we be able to absorb it? Do we have the number of schemes, the potential to put it into education? Easiest thing is you start building more schools, redoing the buildings, start painting the schools, and make it like a Cartoon Network kind of a, classroom should look like full of cartoons everywhere. Those kind of things. That is the immediate response we give. So when we came up with accreditation, there was 2 challenges. One was obviously setting up an authority. The moment we went and spoke to the finance authorities in our state, they said that we will not be able to give you an entire set. So existing manpower that you have, or human resource that you have, you use them for your accreditation, inspectorate system, so on and so forth. That was one big challenge. Second challenge was obviously that when you're creating this body, what are you carving this out of? Are you carving this out of SERT? Or are you carving this out of education, this thing? Or are you carving this out of national, this teachers training modules? What are you carving this out of? So then we came up with this entire policy. But then accreditation, and this is the last point I want to make. The biggest challenge in accreditation is, if I may say, everybody who has an idea how a school should be. And trust me, that is a lot of people. And everybody has a very different idea of how a school should be. So if you look at, say, NQAS, I think there's 73 points. We did 9 points in Shala Siddhi. I think the government of Delhi has, 18 points how a school should be, and so on and so forth. So we then put all of those together. There was a lot of overlap, maybe different words, different ways of assessing, but yeah. And then we came up with our own 500-point scale, which was like a superset of every other scale. So and now where we are stuck is getting everybody to agree on this 500-point scale. And every time anybody says ki bhai, this is how it should be, I say ki your scale is already in the scale. But then everybody else says that theek hai, my scale is there, but I don't want that scale to be in the scale because this is not how it should be. That is where we are currently stuck.
Thank you for wisdom, for wittiness, right? I think some, if tweeting it, a disclaimer. But I think you raised 2 important issues, right? One is the idea. So I want to talk a little bit about, and just come back to you again to understand it a bit better. What is the resistance? Is it to the principle, or is it to the, because people don't know how it will execute?
You need to understand, education department or much of Indian institutions, public institutions in India, are not a revolutionary setup. They've evolved themselves over a very long periods of time. Let's say we talk about the principles of separation of, the judiciary with the legislature, which Dr. Shah just spoke about. Now that also has been evolving itself since the 1860s, and then legislature came in much later.
And similarly, when you look at the financial institutions, so they have also evolved through various scams, So, so similarly, I really should watch my words, Getting a group of civil society people laughing at your jokes is not the best thing to happen. But having said that, yeah. So, but having said that, now education as a system has evolved itself through variety of micro steps. Now, when we talk about the NEP, when you say I'm currently implementing clause 7, which is like having cluster schools. So that goes back on a lot of local interests that get created. It's not that one person is very interested to do this. Dr. Shah also spoke about bringing private and public schools on the single platform. So let's say I'm an MLA from a particular area. You put out that my schools are horrible. They are lacking every possible infrastructure. Private schools are at, say, 200 points and I'm at 100 points. The amount of pressure that would bring on me to increase public expenditure on building that infrastructure, at least to make it visibly possible that the schools are good enough, that was going to be tremendous. And that is going to affect other resource allocations. So currently, what happens is the people who are largely paying for the schools through tax, like people who feel the pinch in every March with the tax, are not the people who are sending the children to those schools. So the resistance is also is that do you really want to invest vis-a-vis building a metro system, to building roads, to having flyovers, to investing in schools where you're not even sending your children to. So those resistance that comes in. I'll give you one last quick example of another form of resistance is, let's say midday meal you want to change to a central kitchen. The first resistance comes from the Anganwadi workers or the self-help group women who are actually cooking the midday meals in those schools. So they are losing out on livelihoods. So resistance are of multiple types. One is of understanding, second is also of livelihoods. Third is also of the kind of pressure that may come. So there are various types of resistance. But in all of this, the best way of navigating this is, the mystery that it is. The mystery. Nobody really understands what will ultimately come out of this if we actually create this. And that mystery can ultimately lead to getting where you actually want to get.
So that could either be we could be optimistic about it or really pessimistic about it. And therein lies the rub, I suppose. Geeta, you wanted to react real quick.
Sure.
Really briefly, I just wanted to say that the example that you gave of how if it is seen, it is visible that, for example, a government school is not doing so well visibly compared to, let's say, the perception that a private school is, how a private school is doing, that there would be this tremendous pressure from the politicians to invest more and to get it visibly looking better and so on and so forth. I think this is an excellent illustration of the kind of problem that we have, which is that the regulator, the bureaucracy, the educational bureaucracy that is meant to be regulating, is torn between this, essentially what is competitiveness between the two sectors. Whereas, let us look at what the objective is. The objective for everybody is that children should be learning well. How does it matter ideologically which sector is producing? Whoever is doing a better job, let the government fund them and let them not be competitors. And I think this goes to the heart of the issue of the establishment of the State School Standards Authority, because the idea behind this provision in the National Education Policy is precisely this, that we have been barking at the wrong tree all this time. We've been talking about inputs. If you look at the Right to Education Act, we've been talking about schools complying with these norms, coming up with the whole list of norms that they should be complying with and getting consensus or agreement around those norms. Whereas, it seems to me that it is not so much the, those widgets and those inputs and those infrastructures that matter so much. But what matters is, at the end of the day, it doesn't even matter who's producing it. What matters is that it is being done well. So my point is that by separating the powers, separating out this conflict of interest that exists at the moment, because that, imagine what would be the incentive for a bureaucrat who's in this position? The incentive would be to try and not make let the private sector look good and to try and curtail the development of the private sector, whereas the objective should be to improve the outcomes in both sectors. So I think that really does go to the heart of how, can we make progress on the establishment in spirit, as the NEP talks about, of the SSSA.
Can I just, sorry if I may just
If I
comment.
may just get to Jayaprakash ji, and then we'll come right back for a round of, sort of cross, right? Jayaprakash ji, what is thinking at the moment? It just switches off, so I will try. Okay, don't worry, it's fine. Jayaprakash ji, I want to talk to you a little bit about what's happening pan-India, right? So in the sense of we've got... So it's probably me, right? Okay. Sure. I'm generally soft-spoken. Yes, thank you. Jayaprakash ji, I want to talk to you about how the progress on this idea is pan-India. How are different states, where are they in their stage of thinking about this, or in their stage of resistance and acceptance, but also in their stage of what problems they are trying to solve right now in the implementation process?
Thank you, Bhavnaji. Thank you, CSF, for inviting me here. And as usual, the education is a field where everybody is like expert. And like if somebody talk about petroleum, coal mines, I think we are clueless. But education, everybody has gone to schools, or somebody is presently also siblings and daughters, somebody is going in schools. So education is one where everybody can talk about. As the conversation keep going here, now the talk is about the recognizing the private, their role and the need for regulation. Actually, two things I want to just clarify. One is, we know that we have more than 15 lakh have schools, and there are around 5 lakh schools from private sectors, and our 45% children goes to the private school. So then there's no point that we are not recognizing the role of this. The whole country recognize the role of private sectors and participations. Second point, the talk of regulation, this chapter 8, Bhavna talks about chapter 8. If you read the chapter 8 very clearly, it talks about learning outcomes. The concept of good or bad school is very prevalent. So if somebody is coming to Delhi, some batchmates or friends, he will come to me and say that we want admission to these 5-10 schools. So these are the list of good schools which he come to know through some friends or some conversation. So the good or bad schools concept is already there, and based on that, we always go to the school or send our children to the schools. But how this is done? Again, chapter 8 divides these things into 3 parts. One is assessment, another is accreditation, and third is regulation. So we must understand that these are the 3 things which need to be done. As far as implementation is concerned, first part is assessment. If some school is good, on what parameter it is good. Somebody comes and say that this school is good for academics, so they want to send the children to that school. Some school is good for extracurricular activities, want to send to that. So these, like pinning down to those particular labels is one of very important aspect, and I think the chapter 8 clearly talks about that. Bhavnaji asked about the implementation plan of the ministry, which I think the chapter 8 says that this triple SA has to be set up. And from the ministry side, like central government side, the CBSC has been nominated as the triple SA authority for central government schools. Joseph Ji is here, he is spearheading the whole program. And so this triple SA, they have already prepared a SQA, the School Quality Accreditation and Assessment Framework, which they have implemented to the more than 200 schools, that is Kendriya schools, Kendriya Vidyalaya schools, and Jawahar Navodaya Vidyalaya schools. So the triple SA with the CBSE for the central government school, they will be nodal for all the central government schools, maybe KV, GNVs, Sainik schools, schools from social justice, tribal affairs, railways, all those things. I'll give you very practical examples. I headed a boarding school. I had a chance to head a boarding schools in Missouri. It's an Ogro school on deputation as railway officer. This was the best government boarding school in country. I rated, I went and received the prize also. Received that. But on what basis that they rated us? Even as a principal, I was the best government boarding school in country, but did not know on what basis they rated us. So now this transparency, the chapter 8 talks about the transparency. On what basis somebody is good, and on what basis somebody is not good. So, and that is also communicated, should be communicated to the principals. The resistance, the IUs, is working at the field at very ground level, talks about the resistance. That labeling is always a problem. So once you start labeling somebody, they will they will be hesitant to participate. So now we should not oppose a system which will go and act as a police, which will go and act as inspector. So we must encourage, we are trying to frame a system which is facilitating nature, which will encourage the children, the schools to improve upon. I'll give a very brief and practical example. I think that relate with the implementation of this whole SQA system in the country, our regulatory systems. We have recently launched PM3 schools, and we have started selecting the schools based on challenge mode methods. We have made on 7 domains, some 60, 70 questions. Like small examples, do you have kitchen garden for implementing MDM meal? Whether you have implemented inter-schools event, you have organized inter-school sports event in your schools. Whether your teachers have started implementing innovative technology, innovative practices in classroom transactions. So small set of questionnaires, and based on that, principal has to fill that forms. So this was very facilitating. Like principal knows where he lacks now. Many of school could not come on those criteria, but we have several round of this selection process. So if I am the principal, suppose after director, if I had a chance to go to the school again and head it, so I know where I lacks actually, and there comes the scope for improvement. Exactly. So that is the basic purpose of assessment. And then accrediting, of course, the parents. So the main key of the NEP is child-centric. The whole of the document, the 80, 90-page document, the basically child-centric. Everything should be for the child, for the welfare of child, for the holistic development of child. So whole purpose is for child-centric. So a child, the parents should know where they are sending their child and what basis. So the whole concept is very creative, and the implementation is though a bit challenge, but I think the acceptability started growing in the systems. As I told the example of this PM3 schools, now I get the call from the principal even, sir, I could not qualify. Then I keep talking to them, on what basis? Okay, we had not organized the inter-school events. Okay, you can do it. Get 2 marks again in the next round of selections. So that is what the basic of this making the school standard authority. And whole framework from the ministry side, I can tell you, the whole framework is ready. We have IT platforms which has been tested in the 200 schools. Recently, we will launch to the whole of the schools, and we have requested state to make a triple essay. Though there are challenges, but mostly states are around rating their SCRTs as triple essays. Now the capacity building of these institutions to come up with the framework, like we have a framework at central level, the state can adopt it or contextualize as per their local need, and of course they can implement it. So on implementation front, there are a lot of issues like making a framework, then making IT portals where the schools are on board, where the parents are on board, where the other stakeholders are on board, and then developing the capacity of schools to clearly understand the purpose. One purpose, once the principal knows that this is facilitating him, this is for improvement, like nobody is going to cut anything. Like regulatory part should come afterwards. Like maybe the SQA, which CBSE has started, they can link it with the affiliation system. The another schools which will come to the CBSE for affiliation, they can see what is your score, what is your level in that quality framework. So on that front, we can do afterwards. Initially, it can be for self-assessment, self-disclosure of their own things, and then improving upon them. And of course, then accreditation and regulation has to happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jaiprakash ji. Parth, there are some, sort of elements in there that are give me reason to be hopeful, but there are some that concern me, and I'm wondering if you might share some of those concerns, right? For example, the idea of beginning small with self-disclosure and self-assessments,
and moving ultimately, building a relationship, which naturally we know will happen with regulation, meaning that schools will be penalized for not meeting X or Y standards. We've seen that happen with RTE. I want to talk a little bit about the perils of setting up this independent regulator. Where might we falter? Where might we get things wrong? And how might it make things worse than they are now if we don't get the design right? And therefore, what do we need to focus on in the design?
I agree with you that there are fundamental challenges in establishing an independent regulator. Right? It's true not just in education, but I think it's true across the sector, as you pointed out, including in financial sector. SEBI has gone through a lot of evolutionary steps in getting where they are today. So I think that's very clear. It's going to be difficult to get this idea into practice. I was looking at the document that came from Amit, which sort of pointed out the CBSE has been appointed as a triple SA authority for central government schools. There are states which have appointed SCS, right? SCRT these are the Punjab and Sikkim have appointed SCRT as the triple SA. Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, and Uttarakhand have appointed the examination board as the triple SA authority, right? Now, one can be sort of in despair looking at this diversity of approaches which are being taken. But I think we need to be a little more tolerant on that front because it is going to take time. And I think a lot of problems were pointed out in terms of human resources allocation, funding, right? And therefore, I think I have to experiment this idea of this multiple approaches in creating the regulatory body. And I think as time goes by, we would learn over a period of time what works better, what does not work, and hopefully we can evolve that model as we go along. So I'm not really concerned about the multiple approaches. I think it's a great thing in some sense, given the India's diversity, that we need to have multiple approaches and not one single body from the top, right? I do sort of agree with you that if learning outcomes becomes the key focus and assessment becomes the key focus, then there is a fear of penalty always at the end of it. And we know that when you make learning outcome assessment high stakes, whether for parents, for children, or for the system, right? Everybody's going to cheat on those outcomes in some form or the other, and it becomes very difficult to enforce it. So I think it has to remain low stakes. So I think as you were pointing out that you don't want to penalize people, you want to incentivize them to improve. So I agree with you that that's really a great approach in the beginning to support schools which are not doing so well in your assessment and find ways to support them to do better next time around, right? So I think the system is sort of thinking through this. Now, my sense is that, yes, it is difficult to do. There is no doubt it's difficult to in every sector. Even TRAI, which is sort of held as the prime example of an independent regulator. Even there, for example, it was created in 1997. In the year 2000, they had amendment to the TRAI Act. They created a TDSAT, a separate appellate authority, right? So they also learned from the process that you cannot have regulator also adjudicating disputes. You need to have a separate body for adjudicating disputes with the regulator that the regulatees would have, right? So I think those are part of learning process. One thing I think we could be happy about or good about is that we have learned this process in other sectors, right? And what has happened in those sectors, maybe we are able to bring some of that learning to also the education sector, right?
Apart from this central thing which we have pointed for the center schools, one is for PM3 school, we also developed a school quality assessment framework, and that is for the state government run schools. So that is being done. We have already created the framework, and we are in the process of selection of the schools. And in this year only, we are going to implement this SQA in more than 10,000 schools. 14,000 is the ultimate aim, but hopefully we'll able to select more than 10,000 schools in first round of selection process. So the practical implementation of that assessment and accreditation, maybe by the end of the year will be there.
Thank you, sir. Geeta, you had a strong reaction to Parth's idea about diversity being, working well. I want to hear from you.
If you look at the whole of the NEP, you see, what is the problem? Why is it that 75 years after independence, we've still not got it right? Whereas many countries more recently begun, their journey of reform. have made much more rapid progress. And we are still saying, well, let's be a bit more patient, let's give it more time. There is only one single reform in the whole of the national education policy that could be called a governance-related reform, and that is the separation of powers, this removal of the conflict of interest, that the government is, both operator, regulator, assessor, and all of that. There's this one single reform, and that is the establishment of the proposal to establish the State School Standards Authority, which is meant to be an autonomous, independent body that will be an independent regulator, doing light but tight regulation based on disclosure, based on a symmetrical treatment of government schools, private schools, and so on. And I agree with you, Parth, regarding the fact that, and with what's been said here as well, that we need not be, that regulator need not be punitive. It would need to take very gentle steps towards improvement and encouragement. All of that is definitely needed. But I think that this very fundamental principle that at the point that you establish the SSSA, if you dilute it by letting it be those agencies that are already, government, arms of government run it, then it vitiates the very fundamental idea of the notion that it needs to be an independent body. I accept the point that it requires, fine tuning and institution building, and whatever we've learned from TRI and from SEBI, though principles from those can be adapted, and it may still take time, and that's good. But I feel that it's really important to recognize that let us not dilute even this one single reform that exists. We have had this model of inputs-based, approach to trying to improve, which has not worked for 75 years. Now there is one new idea on the table, and if we don't run in the spirit in which it is meant, right from the right from the start, I think that's poor show. And I think that the problem is that, we have misdiagnosed the problem, and therefore we've prescribed the wrong medicine. And we've misdiagnosed it monumentally by saying that, it needs to be all these things about, the accreditation needs to be right, and so on and so forth. I think what is needed is some attention to the overall governance environment, the lack of proper incentives. I mean, who is talking about the fact that there's chronic teacher absenteeism? We want to do FLN, we want to do those things. We want to encourage, we want to say that, yes, let's have kitchen gardens and inter-school events and innovative technologies, that those are the parameters of success. We can identify what those parameters of success are. But how do we ensure that it is not as if teachers in the last 75 years didn't know that a well-functioning school, a thriving school that cares for its children should have all these things, should encourage inter-school events. These things were already known before, but why were they not happening? The reason why they were not happening is because the overall governance environment does not encourage it. So we need to attack that. We need to diagnose that as the problem, and the NEP does diagnose it, and it prescribes as well the SSSA. But if we dilute its implementation, I think we won't be doing service. We'll be another 75 years, we'll be here still talking about, how to do it.
I want to use my executive chair a little bit. There are two ideas here. One is independence. One is being independent, which is to say that the decisions that flow from you will work for everybody, or will come from an independent position. The other is to say, what is the easiest way for us to get started at this moment? I don't see them as being at cross purposes necessarily. Maybe a question for the group to think over is, how do you then make the CBSE truly independent in its functioning as SSSA, or for that matter, if it's SERT and so on and so forth. So please, Jayprakash.
Okay, thank you. I think we as a government has learned a lot from you people. So now, like recently we conducted National Achievement Survey, and in the report, in public domain, we said that these are the government schools who is performing worse than the private schools. So it's not matter of who is being nominated as a triple SA. It's a matter how they are functioning, how they are implementing it, be it the government body, be the SCRT, the CBSC, but how they are doing. I think in the government also, what we do now, the transparency is one very, very important aspect, and effective implementation is another one. So there is the processes. The debate, I think, should not divert to the who is nominated as authority, but the how they are doing, how it is being implemented, that is more important. And as everybody keeps talks about the challenges, the first time we are going to like do this thing in our education system, which is huge, huge in the world. So the challenge is to effective implementation, not the who is being nominated as authority.
No, that's a fair point. I do want to come down on Geeta's side also, that the idea of how will they function in the way that we want them to function, right? One of the examples that Parth brought up of TRAI, or for that matter, SEBI, and so the other regulators, every one of them has a parent legislation that talks about how they are to be designed, what their goal and function is. Parth, would you like to weigh in on that, please?
Just as we don't want to be punitive, right, in terms of the assessment and impact of that, I think also in terms of design of a new regulator. So one could think that, initially so there are two aspects to it. One, of course, there's a whole literature about how do you design a regulator, right? How do you select the members of the board, which is going to be a regulatory body? How do you establish independence for the terms of their contract and appointment, right? So I think we should focus on that part of it. So even when CBSC is a triple SA or is SCRT, within SCRT, within CBSC, who would then be performing this function, right? And can we create a system where you can create more independence within them by how people get appointed on the triple SA part of the whatever agency is taking over. So I'm thinking about a bit about design thinking on that part of it, be a very important step, and also I think contribution that civil society can make to ways of thinking about that, right? Second, I think depending on, I think what Geeta was pointing out, focusing more on self-disclosure first as opposed to inspections, right? I think there's a lot of things can be just disclosed automatically. We have UDIs and many other systems already in place, right? And I think giving more. So my sense is that one of the first thing we could do is create a separate sort of way of registering education institutions, right? Whether you are a school or a college, you register under this particular sort of act or legal system. And therefore, part of that could be requirement of disclosure, just like we have for public limited companies, right, which get got on the stock market. And therefore, similarly, I think we can create a robust system of disclosure, which could be a very good starting point in creating that regulatory system. I agree with Geeta that yes, there's a danger, right, of independence getting compromised. Frankly, I don't really see a way around it as much because it's going to be a difficult task for any government to separate out a regulator unless it's been done from the center. The center takes the responsibility of funding, right? Not just the PARAK, which is the central regulator in a sense, or triple SA authority, but also the state triple SAs in a way, right? So that's one way of thinking about funding is a key issue, and so are human resources who gets to work in that triple SA authority. So I think one way to sort of push for the idea that maybe some states can be have independent regulators established with the funding support or other ways, even from civil society organizations can support some parts of that, right? And see whether that delivers a better outcome in what we are looking for, right? So trying out that model could also be worthwhile to really have an independent regulator from the day one.
That's very helpful. Geeta, I will come back to you in 1 minute. Ayush has patiently waited for a while. Why don't I come back to you, Ayush, and see in the state that you're working, sort of on getting this off the ground, what are you seeing in terms of choices that are before you in setting this independent regulator up, or at least functionally independent regulator up?
Sorry, I was at that time. I just wanted to mention a couple of things. The beauty with the Indian bureaucracy is, as you were pointing out, was we may spend years on building a license control Raj, and in 100 days, once we get a message from the government that we want to dismantle the license control Raj, in 100 days we will have an entire liberalized ecosystem. So it is not that the bureaucracy ever comes in way of any form of reform. In fact, we are for reform, whichever way that reform may be. So, and second thing that I wanted to point out was that, we talk about educational outcomes and we keep coming. Education as a sector, we've been shifting a lot of goalposts. You look at health and education. Health has always had a single goalpost: life expectancy. You have to raise life expectancy. And currently, if you look at the social sector, the National Health Mission has been delivering results after results. We have improved by 100 times on various indicators. Education has not had that because we've shifted goalposts. The previous education policies was more about literacy. We have achieved 100% gross enrollment ratios across the country, even in the remotest parts of the country, we have achieved that. So the previous policy has achieved. It's not that we have not achieved. Second thing is, whenever we have an idea with regard to education, it is an expensive idea. So you need to also understand that previously, and there was a very interesting interview of one of our former prime ministers, Mr. Narasimha Rao, speaking in '94, right before launching the midday meal. So everybody had this grand idea that we must do something big, but did we have the resources to match it? And that is where a big question comes in. I'll come back to your question. Big question comes in is, how much resource is any organization willing to fund for this regulator? Second is about the powers. Sir was mentioning that we should go by stepwise approach. Change like the central government has done. Everybody is following a queue, converting an existing body into a regulatory body instead of setting up from scratch a state authority. I'm not very sure where Maharashtra stands on it right now, because things have been changing quite a lot there. But having said that, what are the powers that you give? As Dr. Shah was mentioning, do you give them powers under 18(1), the power to register a school? Do you give them licensing powers? The moment you give them, if you don't give them licensing powers, then I'm sure I'll see newspaper reports saying that we are a toothless regulator. Second and last thing, I also want to point out something that Geeta ji was saying was about, like we always talk about these surveys that learning outcomes are not good enough. Okay, so I probably had one of the largest education districts in this country, from the bureaucracy side. Now, I'd want to tell you something. So we always talk about learning outcomes. Every time some people from Pratham or somebody else comes up with a report, and I am like called by media after media, ki, bhai, you tell us why are 30% of the kids not able to read? And you tell them that last year it was 32, it is just 30. So 2% kids who started reading properly. But then, jokes apart, but then you look at Maharashtra as a whole. We are sending the most number of children to IITs. We have, Indian Express came up with this newspaper report, toppers in ICSE, highest numbers were from Maharashtra. Largest contingency of people entering the UPSC is from Maharashtra. So how do you say that Maharashtra, and let's say newspapers being read, apart from the Hindi newspapers, maximum reading of newspapers is in Maharashtra. People are investing into new newspapers and digital platforms in Maharashtra. So if nobody can read, why are people buying newspapers? So the big question is, where is there a jump in educational outcomes? The momentary jump in education outcomes is in the coaching institute, which is not being regulated.